We have you, sir. Yes. Please identify yourselves when you speak.
Sure. My name is John Kane, otherwise known as Garhio. I am Mohawk or Gunyagahaga. I live on the Seneca Nation territory of Cattaraugus. I'm married to an Oneida woman. I have 3 children and 9 grandchildren. And I come here because I think sometimes we think that we are the most productive activists in the world and in history. We believe that we're doing the work that those before us failed to address. And I'd like to go back in history a little bit and visit some of that work that's been done by people who came before us. I first want to acknowledge that we are in the territory of the Lenape people. And as we come together as Indigenous people, I think it's important to single out the people who have been forced from their own territories and who now live in places that are not necessarily their Indigenous homelands. And they too can be oftentimes be referred to as migrants in their own, as they are forced to live in other territories. Denationalization, to deprive an individual or a people of national character. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Commission on Responsibility identified 32 war crimes, including denationalization. In 1943, the United Nations War Crimes Commission adopted the list of war crimes drawn up in that 1919 meeting. In 1944, Raphael Lemkin coined the term genocide, and he referred to it as coordinated and systematic. His words were, genocide has 2 phases. 1, the destruction of national pattern of the oppressed group. And 2, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. Denationalization was the word used in the past to describe the destruction of a national pattern. In 1945, the United Nations War Crime Commission Committee 3, the Committee on Legal Matters, argued that denationalization was not a single act of depriving a people of their national characteristics, but a program that attempted to achieve this result. Committee 3 also argued that denationalization included the compulsory or automatic granting of citizenship of the occupying power. Committee 3 stated that these activities fall under other headings of the list of war crimes. In October 1945, Committee 3 renamed denationalization to be genocide. On December 11, 1946, the General Assembly...
Excuse me, sir. We're trying to keep this a bit interactive.
I
if you come to a question, please. And
Sure.
If you have any questions to the panelists,
Sure.
Please proceed.
Well, the question that I have is, when we're talking about countries like the United States and Canada, who are restricting the movement of Haudenosaunee, my people in particular, and that restriction is tied to forcing us into their citizenship, forcing us to adopt their passport systems, their forms of identification, not only as we cross through the borders that they put in the middle of our territories, but even as we travel abroad. How is that not a war crime? If denationalization is a war crime, if genocide is a war crime, then how is the extortion of our people to be forced into their citizenship? The Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois nationals, were denied the opportunity to travel to Great Britain, the UK, as were the women a few years later. And even recently, in their attempt to play lacrosse in Israel, they were denied the opportunity to use their passports. And anybody who says that they traveled on Haudenosaunee passports is being untruthful. They traveled on a permission slip from Canada. They traveled, and Israel, who refused to issue them a travel visa until Canada gave them permission, they welched on their promise, they backed out of their promise to recognize the Haudenosaunee passports. And that doesn't even get into the issue about how appropriate it was for us to send our people to a country and how hypocritical it would be for Israel to issue a travel visa or the right to travel for Indigenous people, considering what they've gone through. So my question to the panel and my question to the entire international community is, when do we hold the United States and Canada responsible for the war crime that they're committing when they try to force us into U.S. or Canadian citizenship simply to say that the only way we're going to allow you to travel is if you adopt our citizenship, if you subject yourself to the imposition of our citizenship, especially when you consider that the international community has been doing this not since the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but going back to 1919. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to give that question to our colleague Amy to respond to later. I'll take one more question. Yes, ma'am, you? And we move on to the question raised by our Haudenosaunee brother, and I will ask Amy if she can respond to that.
Thank you. Thank you for first for acknowledging we're on Lenape lands. That's very, very important. I do want to share that the Tohono O'odham Nation shares a similar situation where we were issued tribal IDs. And this was the agreement between the Department of Homeland Security and the Tohono O'odham Nation to allow us to move freely back and forth across the border using that. Now we're in a different situation where they're encouraging us to get our official U.S. passport to move back and forth. I think a lot of people thought that that would keep us safe or somehow assert our rights in a stronger way, but it hasn't, because with this past summer we've actually had two O'odham and Mexico brothers who were using their tribal IDs to move back and forth across the border. They were apprehended and they were deported to Nogales, Arizona. So our own people are being deported on our own lands, and that's dangerous. And because people say that it can't happen because of these agreements and these IDs, doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. And that's something that we're looking out for. I think one way to capture people's attention to how important this is for people to understand the different border policies that have come into place since 2002, because there has been a lot of them. And one of them has been the Real ID Act. And I don't think that a lot of people understand that the stipulations set forth within that affect the entire United States border. And for us, what we've been told is that the 100 miles inland from the United States border is considered a constitution-free zone in regards to Homeland Security. And if we think about the entire U.S. border, not just the northern and the southern border, that includes a lot of big cities. That includes a lot of communities. And if people understood, how that affects them, I think we would have an even greater push for what we're asking for, because we're feeling it. Just because people aren't feeling it doesn't mean that it's not there. But definitely we as border communities are feeling those policies. One thing, I know there's been efforts in the past, but I think we can do a better job, is banding together as border communities. I know for some Native nations, they don't like that term being called a border community, because we were here before those borders existed. And so I think, there's a lot of them. There's the Haudenosaunee, there's the Tohono O'odham, there's the Paskoyaki, there's the Kokopa, there's the Lipan Apache, there's recognized and unrecognized Native nations within the now United States that are affected by borders. And if there's a way, and there is a way, for us to come together to push for our rights to move freely across these colonial borders, we can do that. So I'd like to see something come out of that as well. And then, as always, I think, our young people are the answer. Our young people are the ones that are going to be continuing this fight. And we have to continue educating them on these traditional crossing ways, on our traditional language, our connections to the land, because those are important. When someone comes to us and asks us, I'll just take, for instance, when we go through our checkpoint, we try to answer in clever ways when they ask us if we're U.S. citizens. My uncle, he had my favorite one. They asked him, "Sir, are you a U.S. citizen?" And he says, "The first ones." I'm the first ones, and they just okay, you can pass. But in other ways, we've answered the question with, well, I'm an O'odham. But then in turn they ask us, well, are you a Mexican O'odham or are you a U.S. O'odham? And we don't see a difference. We're just O'odham. So those questions that are going to be asked of our young people in the future, we want them to be able to answer with pride and that knowledge that we have of the history of this land, because it's important to remember that we are the ultimate truth of Native nations in what is now the United States of America. We were here before it was the United States. We were here before it was Mexico. We were here before it was called Canada. And so if we pass along those sentiments and that power language, those power terms, I think that can also be a really good way to do that. So I like to talk to you, and if there's other tribes in here as well, let's start that today. Tapo, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this discussion actually highlights the fact that a passport or other identity card is a piece of paper in some ways. That actually is how I see my passport. Whatever nationality, it doesn't convey anything else extra to what you already have. I'm from one of the indigenous communities, but I carry a different passport now. But that doesn't change who I am. You are who you are, and I think that's what's very important, the recognition and the strength and the belief in your roots, in your identity. And we look to there's a little one here with us. We look to our future generations. Hi. He's waving away. And we look to them to actually have that and to continue that into the future. We had another question. Oh, sorry, I can say. Yes, sir, you have the floor.
Issue regarding Canada and the United States requiring membership from the Haudenosaunee. Okay? My question basically is to you, it's not something they want from us. It's something that they don't want us to have. I majored in Native American history, went through the University of Buffalo, and then went into further studies. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of things that the Canadian and U.S. government don't want us to have is they don't want us to be existent. Because if we're existent, then they have to justify the policies and procedures they've done against us, literally murdering people and still murdering people. And by becoming one of them, then they have nothing to fear. And that's one of the things that I don't agree with the answer, okay, that was given. The United States is covering up its history. So is Canada. And from the sound of it, so is a lot of other countries. And that's where this group of people are going to have to address that. If they don't address it, then they are simply following the U.S. and whoever else is running this little organization here. You've got to start paying attention to the history, because that's what's being followed. That's why children are being torn away from their parents. That's why people are being kicked out of the country without them. Those things are important to some people.
Thank you. And the last question I'm going to take is the gentleman who's been waiting very